There's no place like home, and here at GamesRadar, that's what the Sword Coast has started to feel like for a lot of us. Baldur's Gate 3 is a whole year old, and time has flown by. From the early access character models to Gale's shoe-munching shenanigans, holding Karlach in our arms until the bitter end, and finding out which of your friends is really, really into the Emperor, Baldur's Gate 3 has been a wild ride. And yet, I think I speak for all of us when I say the journey is far from over. Despite the huge game releases still to come in 2024, there's something special about Baldur's Gate 3 that still has us under its thrall, and we can't stop coming back for more. We spoke to some of the GamesRadar team to see what Baldur's Gate 3 means to them, and why we've spent a cumulative 3,383 hours in the game. Here's what Larian's latest treasure means to us, and why it'll likely never be too far from our hearts and minds.
I'm not known for having a great attention span, but I don't think I will ever tire of Larian's finest. A lot of it, naturally, has to do with the sheer amount of choice available, with class, race, and narrative decisions all culminating in very different experiences when combined. However, myriad tabs later, I've still only ever had one Dark Urge playthrough. For that very reason, my first experience with Baldur's Gate 3 has stuck with me ever since, setting the stage for it to become my favourite game ever. Sweetling was a wood half-elf monk with baleful seafoam green eyes and a shock of white hair, neatly tied back lest it get covered in gore and viscera. You got me. My first ever Baldur's Gate 3 run saw me playing as a truly nasty Dark Urge. However, not only was I determined to make her absolutely dastardly, I found myself somewhat handicapped as a consequence of being pretty green at D&D, and also Larian RPGs in general. In turn, that meant that Sweetling's brand of chaos was particularly brutal, having made a fair few of the worst decisions possible to make very early on in the game. By the time I clawed my way to Act 3, for example, one tiefling corpse at a time, I was only level 5. I'd started Act 2 at level 4, just for an idea of how much I was racing through this behemoth of a game at the most haphazard speed possible. The moment I really fell in love with it though, when Sweetling became Ball Slayer, his chosen, and set out to destroy the gate in his name. I finished that 57-hour playthrough almost a year ago today, and I still couldn't be prouder of my little psychopath. Truth be told, I think I'm still chasing that high.
When Baldur's Gate 3 released, I knew nothing about it. The early access somehow flew completely over my head, and the marketing campaign totally missed me. Now granted, this was before it was part of my job to keep up to date on the industry, but my point is this game completely blindsided me. I was vaguely aware of the series and knew it was somehow related to Dungeons & Dragons, but that was the extent of my knowledge. I didn't even know this third installment existed. Now speaking of D&D, the day before BG3 finally released, a party member and close friend of mine suggested I pick the game up to play with them and the rest of my D&D party when it dropped. Admittedly apprehensive, I agreed, and it was one of the best gaming decisions I've ever made. My party and I played the entire weekend, our D&D characters reimagined in Larian's image, and we played them as we would their tabletop counterparts. We continued to do so for months, committing to playing our first blind playthrough together, with details, choices, and actions made in the game bleeding over into our D&D campaign, and where possible, vice versa. It was a fantastic experience. I played through a couple times since solo, and each run discovered new plot points, quests, and details that blew me away each time. It's safe to say Baldur's Gate 3 dominated the tail end of my 2023.
I reviewed Baldur's Gate 3 for GamesRadar, and truth be told, I never actually spent that much time in it after I finished that first playthrough. I'm a person who rarely returns to games after the credits roll at the best of times, and while I did dabble in a Dark Urge run that I still want to come back to, something about really mainlining Baldur's Gate 3 in those manic days ahead of release still makes diving back in a difficult proposition. In many ways, that's testament to Larian's writing. That first playthrough is home to the characters that I built up over those dozens of hours, and I'm kind of loath to change their stories. But while I've not spent that much longer playing Baldur's Gate 3 since launch, I've spent a countless amount of time in the year since it came out paying attention to the community around it. Speedrunners, theory crafters, explorers, streamers, modders, and the performers have all ensured that a year on, I'm still thinking, talking, and writing about Baldur's Gate on a weekly, if not almost daily basis. From my journalistic point of view, that kind of long-form attention is only paid to a very special kind of game. The likes of Dark Souls, Skyrim, Breath of the Wild. And that is what's testament to the generational quality that Larian was able to bring to bear.
Baldur's Gate 3 consumed my life last year, and it made me feel a strong sense of fandom that I haven't truly felt since early Tumblr days when I was a teenager. It brought people together, and as a dungeon master and D&D lover, Larian captured everything I wanted in a game. Strong storytelling, incredible character progression, and the ability to pick up a goblin and chuck him about. The thing that keeps drawing me back to the world of Baldur's Gate 3 is simply the characters. I can't get enough of them. All of the characters feel real, with real traumas, real issues, real insecurities, and goals. Gale especially strikes a chord with me, and his development felt deeply personal to me in a way I have never experienced in a game before. No matter how many times I restart the game and I swear hands down I'll pick new companions, my silly little wizard man finds a way of wriggling himself back into my party. Baldur's Gate 3 captivated me in a way I can't remember any other game doing. All I want to do with my spare time is sit down and adventure across the Sword Coast. Larian pulled off this world masterfully, and I would be lying if I said it's not brought me to tears multiple times. And no, it totally wasn't because Halsin gave me a wooden duck in the epilogue. Do I regret spending a grand total of 11 days of my life and counting in BG3? No, and I would do it again.
Baldur's Gate 3 wholly consumed my attention last year. For a long time, I lived and breathed the Sword Coast, and even after many, many playthroughs, I still find myself coming back for more. Why? Well, there's a very good reason for that. Not only does Larian's RPG offer up a frankly impressive amount of choice and variety, but it also sets the stage for an engrossing role-playing experience in a world full of complex, lovable characters and rich storytelling. Larian's created a veritable D&D playground where you can experiment, and you're almost always rewarded with a new discovery. I was so taken with Baldur's Gate 3 and the many paths it lets you walk that I was already planning out my second and third playthroughs within the first 10 minutes. Aside from the myriad of ways you can play the RPG, the companions turn Baldur's Gate 3 into something truly special. They're the game's beating heart. As someone who always yearns for romance, it's been such a joy to connect with the characters and be able to see diverse romantic relationships blossom. I've come to care for every single one of the possible party members, which speaks to Larian's strong writing chops and the excellent performances of the actors who brought them to life. I've been affected in a very personal way by many of their stories, but Karlax in particular made me feel less alone. And for that, I'll be eternally grateful.
I first tried Baldur's Gate 3 back when early alpha builds were available on Steam in 2019, and the leaps and bounds it's made since then are staggering. Perhaps as close as any game has ever gotten to capturing the spirit, not just of D&D, but of tabletop gaming as a whole. Baldur's Gate 3's strengths are built largely in its willingness to say yes to just about any idea. The game where characters wrestle with trauma and physical mutation and cosmic horror, they will manage to seamlessly share space with Disney characters, bear sex, and weaponized hamsters. Somehow it doesn't feel discordant. And that's no small feat either. The spirit of adventure comes from the idea that we really might discover anything once we set upon the trail. A beach community of confused cod people worshipping a bad-tempered garden gnome after misreading a religious text is the least of it, but a perfect example of the effort and imagination that Larian put into the game. While other RPG titles that came out around the same time were somewhat predictable and content to follow proven trends, BG3 was pioneering new ground in storytelling systems and creativity. It just refuses to be boring, and for that, I'll always love it.
Though Baldur's Gate 3 was playable in early access from 2020, myself and one of my best friends promised to wait until its full release to play, worrying that we would burn out before getting to play the full thing. We kept that promise for 3 years, but less than 2 weeks before Baldur's Gate 3's launch, my friend died unexpectedly. It felt like the world collapsed, and when I returned to work sometime later, I worried that reviewing Baldur's Gate 3 without him would be too painful. Instead, the richness of Faerun became a refuge during the lowest point of my life. Like millions of other players, I laughed and cried my way through the Forgotten Realms like nothing had come before. On a mechanical level, I had never played a game with so much freedom. I've lost track of how often I've shoved would-be mini-bosses off cliffs, or smugly teleported over lethal floor traps instead of disarming them. But it's the companions, who have each lost so much yet still teach us to cling to optimism and keep loving, even after grievous loss, even when it would be easier to stop, who are truly dear to me. Over the last year, I've played Baldur's Gate 3 again and again to remind myself of that, and I've only grown to love it more with each playthrough.
I don't think that a game has ever quite consumed so much of me the way that Baldur's Gate 3 has managed to. I always seem to go back to living and breathing it without fail. Each time, I search every nook and cranny despite knowing by now what to expect. Each time, I read through every silly book I come across, whether it be the salt-stained shanties for the Bitch Queen at the very beginning of the game, or the heartbreaking letters scattered throughout all 3 acts. Each time, I shamelessly romance Astarion. Many of my decisions remain unwavering through each playthrough, but it doesn't ever matter. Somehow, Baldur's Gate 3 always hits me the way a gust of fresh wind on a hot day does. It leaves me feeling as though I've never breathed cleaner air or experienced a more novel game. Despite playing the game what feels like 100 times with, mostly, the same alignment, build, and choices, I never seem to get bored, and that's how I know that Baldur's Gate 3 is brilliant. My ADHD brain often doesn't allow me to even finish a game, let alone replay it on repeat, but that doesn't apply to Larian's banger. I think I love it even more than I love some of my lengthiest Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, and that's all thanks to Larian's mind-bogglingly talented writers, and the RPG's staggering ability to immerse me within all its digital corners of Faerun from the city to the Underdark. And as long as I can get my weekly fix of banter, blood, and one very handsome vampire, I'll be one happy adventurer.
When I play pretty much any video game, I've got a real problem with exploring every nook and cranny, and it's an awful habit because it means games take me ages to complete, and I sometimes wear myself out aimlessly trying to turn over every single stone. However, Baldur's Gate 3 is such a densely packed, well-engineered carnival of chaos that I was able to fully indulge in my obsessive exploration and not feel that guilty about it. Avoiding the beaten path led me to secret declarations of goblin love, a bugbear and an ogre getting it on, sacrificial fish people rituals in caves, an underwater prison with perhaps one of the most tense and challenging video game encounters I've played, and so much more. For every 10 empty or rotting crates I rifled through, I found one totally unexpected encounter that often had me in hysterics or leaning intently towards my monitor, often because Shadowheart had been incapacitated by some horrific creature for the second time, leaving Lae'zel, my beloved Karlach, and myself with our guts almost hanging out. My only complete Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough, all 133 hours of it, was one of the most surprising and rewarding experiences I've had playing a video game, and yet, in some places, I still feel like I've just scratched the surface.
Do you have any memories of Baldur's Gate 3 that you would like to share with us? Leave them in the comments down below, and make sure to stick with GamesRadar for the latest news, previews, and more.